A little girl in a pink dress crashed a mafia boss's wedding. She ran straight down the aisle, pushed through the crowd, and screamed at the top of her lungs, "Don't marry her." And then something happened that nobody in that room could explain. Nobody moved. Not the bodyguards, not the senator standing 3 rows back, not the 50 people who all had very good reasons to make that little girl disappear. Nobody. Because in a room full of people who had spent their entire lives lying, a 5-year-old just said the only true thing anyone had said all night. And the most dangerous man in Chicago heard it. And for the first time in 11 years, he had no idea what to do next. This is not a story about crime. This is a story about a woman who spent 8 months being invisible and used that invisibility to uncover a secret her father died protecting. A secret that could bring down a senator, expose 20 years of corruption, and change everything she thought she knew about the man who raised her. She had no weapon, no allies, no plan. Just 34,000 documents memorized, a map that should have been burned, and the one thing nobody saw coming her. This channel is for people who understand that some are born to lead and some are born to rule. And the difference between those two things is everything. There are lessons that no classroom will ever teach you. Only the ones who have truly held power know them. We don't tell crime stories here. We tell stories about mindset, about backbone, and about the real secrets behind real power. What this story gives you, the understanding that being overlooked is not a weakness. It is the most dangerous advantage you can have. That the truth, properly preserved, outlasts everyone who tries to erase it. And that the most powerful move you will ever make is the one nobody saw coming. If this story made you think differently about power, about patience, about what it really means to be dangerous, hit like, leave a comment, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe. Because the next story is already waiting, and it will change the way you see everything.
She had memorized the location of 34,000 documents, and not one of them told her why her father had to die. Nora Voss worked alone in the basement of the Hargrove Institute most evenings. Not because anyone asked her to. Because 9 o'clock at night was the only hour in Chicago when the world left her alone. No colleague stopping in the doorway. No one looking at her with that particular expression people reserved for daughters of dead men. Just fluorescent light, old paper, and the sound of her own footsteps echoing down a corridor that stretched the length of a city block underground. She was sorting a donation box that evening. Artifacts pulled from a demolished building in Pilsen, the kind of neighborhood that kept getting swallowed and rebuilt every 20 years. The box held the usual things: letters tied with kitchen twine, photographs with no names on the back, architectural drawings for buildings that no longer existed. She worked fast. Letters to shelf A, photographs to shelf B, drawings to shelf C. 8 months at this job had made the sorting automatic. Her hands moved while her mind stayed somewhere else. Somewhere it had been living since the previous March, in a police precinct on the south side, listening to a detective explain that her father's case was closed. 72 hours. That was how long it took them to decide Edmund Voss died in a robbery gone wrong. 72 hours to close the file on a man who had spent his whole life being careful. She reached the last document in the box, and she stopped. It was a map, not an ordinary one. She knew the draftsmanship before she was even fully looking at it, the particular weight of the lines, the way the symbols sat on the page like they had been placed instead of drawn. She had seen this map before. In her father's apartment, the night before he died, in a stack of papers he told her not to touch yet. That map was supposed to have been burned. Nora did not panic. She had learned a long time ago that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She assessed. She noted. She decided. She folded the map in thirds, slid it into the inner pocket of her coat, and picked up the next document like nothing had happened. That was the first thing to understand about her. She didn't flinch. She adapted. Her coworker Dennis leaned into the doorway around 9:15, tie loose, looking the way everyone looked at the end of a long Tuesday. "We're ordering pizza. You in?" "No thanks." "You sure? You look like you haven't eaten." She looked up. "I ate. I just look like this." Dennis laughed and disappeared. When he was gone, she looked at the empty doorway for a second. Not because she wanted pizza, because of what Dennis represented: a normal Tuesday, uncomplicated by maps that were supposed to be ash. Then she went back to work. The reading room was one floor above the archive. It was where outside researchers came by appointment to access materials they couldn't take off-site. Nora brought a document box up just before closing time, and that was when she noticed him. He was sitting at the table nearest the door, navy sweater, reading glasses, a notebook open in front of him. No phone, no laptop. In 2024 in Chicago, that wasn't a lifestyle choice. That was a decision. She had seen him before, 3 times in the past 2 weeks, always arriving just before closing, always sitting at the same table. She knew because it was her job to know who used the archive, what they requested, when a pattern changed. This man had requested nothing. Phil, the evening security guard, had already opened the door when the man arrived, not because it was procedure, but because Phil knew to open it. The other researchers in the room had drifted, without discussion, to tables farther away. Nobody explained it. Nobody noticed they'd done it. Nora was carrying the document box past his table when he spoke, without looking up from his notebook. "Box 7C has been reshelved out of order. Third shelf from the left, someone moved the 1940 through 1943, section behind the 1951 through 1955. In case it matters." She stopped. She looked at the shelf. He was right. Completely right. Nobody would have known that unless they had memorized the arrangement from previous visits and noticed the deviation. "How do you know that?" He looked up for the first time. His eyes weren't cold. They were calculating the way a person looks when they're reading a map rather than looking at a face. "I notice things that are out of place. It's a habit." She didn't say anything more. She got the box. When she returned to her desk, she didn't open it immediately. She sat still for a moment. The most informed person in any room had just told her he noticed when things didn't fit, and the map folded in her coat pocket felt suddenly heavier. At 9 o'clock, she walked through to check the reading room. He was still there, notebook closed now, watching the doorway before she stepped through it. "We closed at 9. It's 8:58. You've been here 4 hours and you haven't requested a single document." He considered this briefly, the way a person considers how much of a true thing to offer at once. Sometimes you come to a place just to remember what it used to hold. Nora looked at him, not with curiosity about him personally, with the curiosity of someone cataloging information. What did that sentence mean, and why did he choose to say it right now? "You knew Edmund Voss." Not a question. He didn't confirm it, didn't deny it. He stood, pulled on his coat with deliberate ease. But at the door he paused, not turning back. "Your father was a very careful man, Miss Voss. That's a quality worth inheriting." Phil had the door open before his hand reached the handle. He walked out. Nora stood alone in the empty reading room. Her hand was in her coat pocket, touching the folded map. She had 34,000 documents memorized. She had no file on this man. That was either an accident or a warning. And she had stopped believing in accidents 8 months ago. She slept 3 hours. The map was spread across her kitchen table in the morning, lit by a desk lamp angled low. She had been staring at it long enough that the symbols had stopped looking like symbols and started looking like a language she already knew. Because she did. Her father had built this encoding system for her when she was 9 years old. He called it their bedtime story game. He would draw small maps with hidden messages in the symbols, and she would decode them before she could sleep. A mountain meant a powerful figure. A river meant money moving. A broken line meant information not yet confirmed. A solid line meant evidence. She had thought it was just a way he had of connecting with her after her mother died. Now she understood he had been teaching her something else entirely. 3 names appeared in the map's network. 2 of them she recognized from 8 months of careful, solitary observation. The third one made her put her hands in flat on the table and breathe slowly. Senator Harlan's mast. currently running for governor of Illinois. The phone rang. Unknown number. She didn't answer. It rang again. And a third time. She picked up. I need to see the map, Miss Voss. Not to take it. To explain it. How do you have this number? The same way I know you found it last night. The same way I know you haven't slept. She looked at the window. The curtains were drawn. She sat still for 8 seconds. Then she said one word. Where? A small breakfast diner in Pilsen. Corner table, back to the wall, facing the door. 2 cups of coffee already waiting. The man from the reading room. Callum Reyes. That was the name he gave her when she sat down, and the way he said it, without preamble or performance, told her it was real. She had not brought the map. He noticed immediately and gave the slightest nod. It was the right answer. A person who brings the map to a first meeting with a stranger doesn't understand the situation. A person who leaves it at home knows exactly what she's doing. The coffee on the table was what she drank. She didn't ask how he knew. There were more important questions. Your father worked for me, Callum said. Not officially, nothing on paper. For 20 years, he documented things I couldn't document without exposing myself or the people I protect. Relationships, financial movements, who was connected to whom and how. He built a map of it, all of it. Nora said nothing. She was storing the information before deciding what to do with it. Someone found out what he was doing, Callum continued. I don't know who. The map you found is either bait or it's what your father wanted someone specific to find. I need to know which. And you think I can tell you. I think you already know. I think you've known since last night. A long moment. She drank the coffee, set it down carefully. Then she looked at him directly. He encoded his maps in a system he built for me when I was 9. Bedtime stories with hidden coordinates. It was the first real thing she gave him, not because she trusted him, because it was the only path to understanding what her father had been doing, and she needed that more than she needed to be cautious. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because I've spent 8 months trying to find out who ordered what happened to your father. I've found nothing. And in 11 years of doing what I do, finding nothing means I'm missing a variable. He looked at her steadily. I think the variable is you. She saw the man across the street when they were halfway through the conversation. Gray parka, standing still. She had seen him 2 hours earlier, 2 blocks from the institute. She kept talking for 15 seconds to confirm he wasn't moving. Then, in the same tone someone might use to mention the check. The man in the gray parka across the street. Is he yours? Callum didn't turn his head. No. Then we have about 4 minutes. He stood, left money on the table without counting it. Back door, left down the alley, right on 19th. Green door, go in, go up, I don't know you. No, but you knew your father, and he trusted me. The listener, she thought of herself that way sometimes. When important decisions arrived, the listener does not know if Nora stood until she stood. It wasn't an emotional decision. It was logic. Her father was the most careful man she had ever known. Whatever Callum Reyes was, Edmund Voss had believed he was worth something. That was enough to take one more step. The room above the diner was empty. 1 table, 2 chairs. Not a place designed to impress anyone. A place designed to see whether a person could be still when the room gave them nothing to react to. What happened to the man following me? He's being redirected. He'll spend the next 2 hours explaining himself to someone with better questions than either of us. She studied him. The part he was saying was true. She had learned to read that distinction from her father. A complete liar looks different than a partial truth-teller. This man was looking at her directly. I want to find out who killed my father. I know, and you want the map. I want to understand what he was trying to tell us when he made sure it survived. A beat. She looked at her hands. Then we want the same thing. You don't trust me, he said. It wasn't an accusation. No, I trust the fact that you knew my father. And my father was the most careful man I've ever known. Whatever you are, he believed you were worth documenting. That's enough to continue. It's not enough to trust. He looked at her for a moment. Then, that's fair. One more thing, Nora said. If you lie to me even once, I stop. And I take the map somewhere you can't find it. Understood. She stood. Same time tomorrow. I'll need to decode the rest of the map before we can do anything useful with it. Bring coffee. She walked out before he could respond. In 11 years of running information across the city, it was the first meeting that had ended on terms that weren't his. His real office was on the 14th floor of an ordinary-looking building in West Loop. No name on the door, no logo in the lobby directory. Someone walking past would assume it was a mid-sized accounting firm. Nora stepped inside and looked around. Not what she expected. No expensive furniture, no display of power. This was the workspace of someone who actually worked, maps on the walls marked up with pen, files organized in a system she recognized on site because it was a real system, not decoration. A desk positioned near the window for reading light, not for the view it offered. Then she saw the left wall. Chicago across different eras: 1871, 1920, 1968, 2010. And between those, other maps whose draftsmanship she recognized from across the room before she was close enough to read a word. That's my father's work. 12 years of it, Callum said from behind her. He updated them every quarter. She moved closer. Her fingertips touched the edge of one, not to take it, just to feel the paper. He never showed me these. He was protecting you. From what? From knowing what he knew. You can't know and be safe. He chose your safety. She didn't respond right away. She looked at the maps, and somewhere in that looking, she made a decision. Not forgiving her father for keeping her in the dark, just understanding why he did it. Those were two different things. She had been confusing them for 8 months. She brought the map out, spread it on the table. Callum stood on the other side. She explained the encoding system, the mountain symbols and river symbols, the solid lines and broken ones, speaking fast and precisely, not over-explaining anything that didn't need explanation. Callum didn't interrupt, didn't ask unnecessary questions, and he understood faster than she'd expected, not politely nodding, but actually integrating. She could see him placing each piece of information into a framework already built in his mind. For every name she decoded, he provided context she didn't have. They worked the way people work after years of collaboration, except they had met 2 days ago. Then she decoded a complex symbol near the center of the map and asked about a location on the north side. Callum didn't pause to think. He went to the filing cabinet, opened the third drawer from the left, counted 6 folders from the right edge, and pulled one out. Exact. No, searching, the same way she moved in her own archive. You organize by the same system my father used. He taught me. A small beat. She looked back down at the map. Something shifted, not full trust, but recognition. This man had known her father in a real way. Not known about him, known him. They kept working. An hour in, the picture changed. Her father hadn't only been mapping relationships and financial movements, he had been building something else underneath a parallel record. Every transaction linked to evidence, every meeting documented with dates and locations, every dollar traced to its source, 20 years of it. He was building a case, Nora said. He was building something bigger than a case, Callum said quietly. She looked at the map again. The 7 locations she hadn't decoded, yet they weren't people. They were coordinates, physical places where something was stored. He divided it, she said. Whatever he built, he divided it into pieces and hid them separately. This map's directions to the pieces. Callum was very still. How many? 7, at minimum. He built a library. He built a bomb, Nora said. She looked up. And he left the detonator to me. They stood looking at the map without speaking for a while. Did you know what he was building? She asked. Callum thought before answering. He didn't answer questions about himself quickly, she'd noticed that. I knew he was documenting. I didn't know the scope. If I had, he stopped. You would have stopped him, she said. I would have been more careful with him. That sentence wasn't about strategy. The listener, Nora, heard what he didn't say. I let him die because I didn't know enough. It was the first crack in the controlled surface, and it was real. She didn't push it. She just said, there are 3 more sections of the map I need time to decode fully, and I want to do it here, with access to your files. Some of these names I won't recognize without context. Whatever you need. I'm not doing this for you. I know. She pulled on her coat. He didn't offer to walk her out. She didn't expect it. But at the door, without turning around, she said, "My father was right about the filing system. Yours is better organized than mine." She left before he could respond. In 11 years of working alone, it was the first compliment he hadn't seen coming. She brought food the next morning. No explanation, no question, just 2 sandwiches from the deli 2 blocks from her apartment, set one in front of Callum, and sat down and opened the map. He looked at the sandwich, then at her, then at the map. "You didn't have to, I know." He ate, no verbal acknowledgement, but the way he ate with attention, without rush, like a man unaccustomed to being looked after in small ways, was its own kind of answer. She recognized it because her father had been the same way. They worked in silence for 2 hours, the same rhythm, high focus, no background noise, no need to fill the quiet with words. At some point, she noticed his notebook on the corner of the desk. Not notes. Questions, listed and numbered, most of them still open. This man lived with more unanswered questions than answered ones. She understood that particular way of moving through the world. The phone rang just before noon. She looked at the screen. "Daniel." She answered. Her brother's voice came through warm and easy, the way it always did. He had inherited their father's quality of making any room sound safer just by being in it. He wanted to come to Chicago that weekend. Dinner at the restaurant their father had loved on Clark Street. He missed her. She told him yes, confirmed the date, kept her voice easy. When she hung up, her face changed. "Callum," without looking up, "he doesn't know." It wasn't a question. "He's finishing his last year. He has a thesis and a girlfriend and a life that has nothing to do with any of this. He'll find out eventually." Eventually isn't now. Callum looked up this time. He watched her the way he watched most things, not evaluating emotionally, but recognizing something. "Your father did the same thing, kept everyone from knowing, carried it by himself." Is that a warning? An observation. The Voss family has a pattern. She knew he was right. That didn't help. She didn't say anything else, because some true things don't need a response. They just need to be heard. They decoded the second major section of the map that afternoon, and a name appeared that stopped them both. Ryan. It wasn't Mast, wasn't Webb. Just that one word in her father's encoding, tied to a river symbol, money moving, and a broken line that had been revised to solid sometime in what looked like year 4 or 5 of the records. "Who is Ryan?" she asked. Callum was quiet longer than usual. "My younger brother." She waited. He worked in finance. Smart, careful, good at making money move through legal channels in ways that weren't quite legal. He was building a case, his own case, against people I'd been watching for years. He didn't tell me because he was afraid I'd make him stop. He paused. "What happened?" "He disappeared on a Thursday. They found his car by the river. No body." He said it, the way someone reads a report, flat, precise. Nora understood that wasn't because he felt nothing. It was because he had said those words to himself enough times that they no longer had a shape. She had her own sentences like that, the car in the lot. The file closed in 72 hours. The apartment already searched when she got there. "That's why you started. That's why I became very good at knowing things before they became problems." Then she looked at the name Ryan in the map again. Her father had put it there, which meant Edmund Voss had known, had tracked what happened to Ryan Reyes year by year through his system of mountain symbols and river symbols and lines that went from broken to solid as the evidence accumulated. "My father mapped what happened to your brother. It's here." Callum didn't move. She saw his hands laid flat on the table still. He was holding himself in place. "Show me." She didn't point at the map and explain from across the table. She stood, moved around his side, placed the map between them, and read it to him item by item, slowly, in order. Not because he couldn't have read it himself, because this was news about a brother, and nobody should have to read that alone. When she finished, neither of them spoke for a while. They stood close, not touching, just close, and looked at the map together. Maybe 30 seconds of silence. Then he said, very quietly, "He left a record for every person he lost. Your father was very thorough." And she said, without thinking, "He loved people by documenting them. It was the only language he had." She hadn't said that out loud before. She hadn't even thought it clearly until the words came out. But as soon as they did, she knew they were true. Late that evening, when they were packing up, Callum held the rolled map out to her. Tomorrow, same time? I have work until noon. After that, I'll have food here. She looked at him, not surprised noting it. You don't have to. You brought a sandwich this morning. That was different. Was it? She didn't answer. She took the map and walked out. In the elevator going down, she found herself thinking not about the map or mast or the 7 hidden locations. She was thinking about the way Callum had said Ryan's name. Like it was still present tense. Like the loss hadn't finished happening. She understood that grammar. She had been using it for 8 months. Someone had been in the archive overnight. Nothing was taken, careful enough that a person who didn't know the space intimately would never have noticed. But Nora noticed a document box, opened and closed out of the sequence she left it in. One box among thousands, replaced with near-perfect precision. Near perfect. She did not call the police. She called Callum. He arrived in 20 minutes, and for the first time, she watched him operate in her space, not a room he controlled. What she observed. He treated her archive with the same respect he gave his own. He didn't touch what didn't need touching. He moved through the space carefully, then came back to her and reported as though she were the one making the decisions. Which she was. 3 people had access last night, he said. 2 are your colleagues with key cards. The third came through the loading dock. How do you know that? Because the loading dock camera has a 14-second blind spot every hour on the hour. And the person who came through knew that. You mapped my building. I map buildings where people I'm responsible for spend time. A pause. Am I someone you're responsible for? He looked at her steadily. You are now. Not romantic, factual. But she saw something in his expression that he hadn't put into words yet. To find out who had entered the archive, they needed to speak with someone in the information network Callum maintained across the city. He asked if she wanted to come. She said yes. A woman named Claire Dolan, mid-50s. She ran a dry cleaning business on the north side and managed information about most of what moved through that part of the city. They met at a restaurant on a quiet block, not fancy, not obscure. A diner that existed in the middle of everything without anyone paying attention to it. Nora watched Callum work. He didn't threaten, not even close. He asked questions but framed in a way that made clear he already knew the answer and was simply offering the other person a chance to confirm it. His power wasn't, I will hurt you. It was, I know enough about you that you want me as an ally, not an adversary. Claire looked at Nora. Edmund's daughter, you knew my father? Everyone who mattered knew Edmund. She turned back to Callum. The person you're looking for isn't operating small. They work for someone who has been very quiet for a very long time, and whatever they want, she nodded at Nora. They want her, not the archive. Walking back to the car afterward, Callum said what he had been holding back. There's something you need to understand about the map. Tell me. Your father didn't leave it in the archive accidentally. He arranged the donation. The specific box, the specific destination, your archive, your shift, he set it up months before he died. Nora stopped on the sidewalk. He knew he was going to die. He knew someone would come for him eventually. He didn't know when, so he built a way for the work to reach the right person if something happened to him. Me. You. He spent 20 years keeping you out of this world. The last thing he did was decide you were the only one who could finish what he built. She stood there in the November wind off the lake and let that settle. It wasn't only grief. Her father had seen her, had known what she was capable of, not despite the fact that he'd kept her in the dark, but maybe because of how carefully he'd watched her through all the years he was doing it. He could have burned all of it, she said. Yes, he chose not to. He chose you. On the sidewalk outside his building, she said, I need to think tonight. Take tonight, Callum. She looked up at him. When this is over, what happens to you? A long second passed. That's the first time you've used my name. Answer the question. I don't know yet. Clearly true. She nodded. Walked away. He stood on the sidewalk until she turned the corner. He had catalogued everything about Nora Voss in the past 4 days, how she decoded, how she made decisions, how she said true things without announcing them. He had not opened a file on her. In 11 years, he had opened a file on everyone who mattered. He was beginning to understand what the absence of that file meant. The last section of the map took most of a day to decode. They worked through it together, and by now they had a shared shorthand that had developed without either of them planning it. She named a location. He was already pulling the folder. He described a connection. She had already found the corresponding symbol. No extra words needed. The kind of rhythm that usually took years to build. When the full picture emerged, it was both larger and stranger than either of them had expected. The evidence Edmund had assembled wasn't stored in one place. It had been divided into 7 pieces, 7 separate locations across the region. Chicago, a suburb to the northwest, Milwaukee, and one location that made Nora go very still. Boston, she said. Yes. That's where Daniel is. Yes. She looked at Callum. He looked back. Neither of them said the obvious yet, that whoever was searching for the evidence would eventually work that out. The unspoken question sat between them like weather. That evening, Callum ordered food from a Polish restaurant around the corner, a real dinner, not sandwiches, a full meal. For the first time, the map was folded and set aside. They ate at the desk like 2 people who had been working in the same room long enough that eating together didn't require acknowledgement. She asked him where he had learned to read maps. He told her about a branch library in Pilsen, the same neighborhood where they'd first met for breakfast, and an old man named Andrzej, a Polish immigrant, who had taught cartography informally to anyone who would sit down and pay attention. Andrzej believed that maps were the most honest thing human beings made. He said, "Show me where a person lives, where they work, where they eat, where they go at night, and I will tell you everything about them that their own words never will." My father said something like that, Nora said. I know. He quoted Andre often. That's how we met. I was at that library when I was 19. Your father came in looking for historical maps of the city's water system. Andre introduced us. You knew each other a long time. 15 years. He came to me after Ryan disappeared. He was the only person outside my network who knew to come to me. Why? A pause. He said he'd been watching me map people for years, and I was the only one doing it to protect them, not to use them. Is that still true? It used to be cleaner. No apology in his voice. No request for sympathy. Just an honest assessment. I started to protect people. Then I became something people needed protecting from. Your father kept mapping me through all of it. I never understood why. Because he thought you could come back. Callum looked at her for a long moment. He had no answer for that. A message came in near 9 o'clock. One of his people, a man who managed information in the financial district, had been exposed and was in immediate danger. Callum was on his feet before she fully processed what had happened. He made calls, gave instructions, moved through the room. Fast, precise, quiet. No shouting, no visible panic. Just the controlled forward motion of someone who had handled crises long enough that each one had its own efficient shape. In the middle of it, he looked at her twice, not to check if she was safe, like her presence was what kept him calibrated. When it was resolved 4 minutes, maybe 5, he stood at the window. Nora moved to stand beside him. The city below was lit up the way Chicago looks in winter, bright and cold and very large. I've been doing this alone for 11 years, he said. Alone is easier, decisions happen faster. But tonight I looked up and you were in the room, and something in the decision was clear. A long pause. Callum, I need to tell you something. Tell me. I think I understand what my father was saying, not just with the map. To me, specifically. She stopped. He was saying, "This is the world. Don't look away from it, and don't face it alone," said. He looked at her. Didn't speak. But the space between them drew in, not because either of them moved, but because both of them stopped pretending it was wider than it was. He put his hand over hers, slowly, the way you set a book down when you don't want to make noise. She didn't pull back. They stood looking at Chicago, hand in hand, no words. She would think about this moment later, the way you think about the last good day of a season. You never know it's the last one until it's already gone. Marcus Webb called her the next morning. She recognized the name from the map, a former colleague of her father's, someone who appeared in the network as a broken line that never resolved to solid. He asked to meet privately, without Callum. He said there was something she needed to hear before she decided what to do with it. She went. She didn't tell Callum. They met in a park near the lake. Webb was older than his photographs, tired in the way that went past the body and into something deeper. But his eyes were sharp. He told her Callum Reyes had known Edmund Voss was in danger, not suspected known. A week before Edmund died, Callum had received specific information about a threat. He had not warned Edmund. Nora said nothing for a moment. "Why not?" she finally asked. "I don't know. That's what I need you to find out." She stood, walked a few steps, turned back. "Where did you get this?" Webb didn't answer fast enough. "You're either telling me the truth," she said, "or you're the person who arranged what happened to my father. Which is it? It's not that simple." "Yes, it is." She walked back to the car. Her hands were steady. Her mind was not. She went directly to Callum's office. "Did you know someone was coming for my father a week before he died?" He looked at her. He didn't answer immediately, and that pause, brief, maybe 3 seconds, was already the answer. "Tell me," she said. "I received a warning. General, not specific, that someone in the network was at risk. I increased security on 3 people. Your father wasn't on the list because my information indicated the threat was targeting me, not him. But he died, not you." "Yes, and you've known that for 8 months." "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "You let me spend a week in this room, reading his maps, telling you things I haven't told anyone. And the whole time you knew you might have been able to save him. I didn't know for certain. You knew enough to wonder. And you said nothing." He didn't deny it. He didn't offer a polished apology. She would have heard the hollow sound of it. He said the true thing instead. "I was afraid that if you knew, you'd stop. And I needed you to finish decoding the map." Not a clean admission, an honest one. It was worse than any excuse could have been, because it didn't pretend to be something better than it was. Nora looked at him for a long time. At least that's honest. His phone buzzed. One of his people came to the door, quiet, professional. 3 words. Mast was moving. He had identified Daniel's location in Boston. Not this weekend. Tonight. Callum handled it in 3 minutes. Calls, coordination, coverage. Daniel was safe. Nora stood and watched him do this. He did it right. He did it fast. He protected her brother, the brother of the man he hadn't saved. She didn't say thank you. She picked up her coat. "Nora, Daniel is safe. That's what matters right now. I should have told you." "Yes." She stopped at the door, didn't turn around. "The map is decoded. You have what you need to finish this. You don't need me anymore." "That's not good night, Callum." She walked out, the door closed. He stood in the office looking at the closed door, looking at the map on the table, looking at 2 cups, one hers, not finished from the night before. He had spent 11 years knowing everything about everyone. He had known, with uncomfortable precision, what it would cost her to learn what he hadn't said. He had told himself the mission came first. He had known, with the same precision, that he was lying. Some things you know and still choose not to act on. Those are always the things that cost the most. 3 days. Nora stayed home, didn't go to the West Loop office, didn't reach out. She worked alone, using everything she had decoded from the map to trace the 7 locations herself, to understand the full structure before anyone moved to collect anything. And in that process, she read every map her father had ever made for her through a different lens. Edmund Voss had known the full picture of Callum Reyes, the good parts and the parts that had gone wrong. He had chosen to work with him anyway. He had chosen at the end to send his daughter to him to finish what he had built. That was not forgiveness of Callum. That was understanding of her father. 2 different things. She had been confusing them for 8 months about other things too. Daniel called on the second day. He knew something was wrong. The security coverage Callum had sent to Boston had been visible enough for a sharp 22-year-old to notice. This time, Nora didn't perform. She told him the truth. Not all of it. Enough. Their father had done dangerous work for 20 years. Because he believed it mattered. He had loved both of them the only way he knew how, by keeping them safe from what he was doing, and by watching over them so carefully that when the moment came, he knew exactly who could carry it forward. Daniel was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Did he trust you to finish it?" "Yes." "Then finish it, Nora." That's what he's saying. She sat with the phone after they hung up. In her father's old reading chair, she had brought to her apartment after his apartment was cleared. The chair smelled like him still paper and coffee, and something she had no name for except familiar. She thought, he was right about the chair too. Callum did not look for her. He gave her the space she had taken, because it was hers to take. But he did not sit still. He met with Marcus Webb not to confront him, to hear him. Webb had observed both Edmund and Callum from the outside for long enough to see what neither of them could see in themselves. "Edmund didn't just trust you with his work," Webb said. "He trusted you with his daughter's safety. That's not the same thing as telling you everything. That's telling you what matters most. I failed him. You failed him once. Then you spent 8 months not failing everyone else." Webb paused. "The question isn't what you did. It's what you do now that you understand the cost." Callum went back to the office. He opened a new file on his computer, typed a name at the top, Nora Voss, sat looking at it for several minutes, then closed it, didn't delete it, didn't fill anything in, left it blank. For the first time in 11 years, he chose not to know in advance. Senator Mast made his move on the archive on the third day. He used political leverage to request that the Hargrove Institute surrender documents potentially relevant to a federal inquiry, the legal mechanism for making evidence disappear. Callum responded not with violence, with information. He sent preliminary evidence of Mast's connection to the archive break-in to 3 independent journalists simultaneously. Not enough to prosecute, enough for Mast to understand if you continue, the story goes out. Mast pulled back, not done, paused. The real evidence still needed to be assembled and placed correctly to matter, and the only person who could navigate the complete map was the woman who had stopped returning his calls. He could find her. He could find anyone in this city. But finding someone and having the right to ask them to come back, those were two entirely different things. He understood that distinction now. He hadn't before. She arrived on the 7th morning, no call, ahead. She walked in, nodded to Phil, and went upstairs. Phil held the door for her. He always had, but she noticed now that the quality of the gesture had changed. Less deference, more simple recognition. She wasn't sure when that had shifted. Callum was at his desk reading when she appeared in the doorway. He set the book down slower than usual, with more attention, the way you set down something that matters when you realize you might have to put it down for a while. She stood in the doorway. "I have 2 conditions. Tell me. First, if you receive information that affects my safety or Daniel's, you tell me immediately. Not after you've calculated whether it serves the mission." "Agreed." "Second, when this is over, I want to know everything, not a summary. Everything. I'll decide what I do with it. That's not a simple ask. I know. It's what I need." A pause. "Agreed." She walked into the room. "I'm not saying I've forgiven you. I'm not asking you to. I'm saying I understand why you made the choice you made, and I think you were wrong, and I think you know you were wrong. Yes." That's enough to continue. She put her coat on the back of the chair, the same chair she'd used every day before. "Show me where we are." They worked differently now. A small deliberate distance maintained, acknowledged by neither of them, but also more efficiently because there was nothing left to perform. No careful management of what they revealed. They were past the point where performance was possible. Callum asked her opinion on a witness approach. He didn't need her input. He had far more experience in this than she did. But he asked. She gave her view. He adjusted the plan accordingly. On his desk was a new book, A History of Cartographic Practice in Chicago, covering the same era as her father's career. He was studying Edmund's field, not to manipulate her. This because he wanted to understand the man. She saw the book, said nothing, but something eased in her that had been held tight for 7 days. They went to the first location on the map together. It was a storage unit in a building near the river, the kind of place designed to be unmemorable. The evidence was where Edmund had placed it, a sealed container inside a unit, rented under a name Nora recognized as her grandfather's old business registration. Her father had been thorough in ways she was still discovering. Mast's people were watching. 2 of them, in a vehicle at the end of the block. As Nora and Callum came back down the stairwell, she saw the exit routes and understood immediately that the main door was the wrong choice. Callum was already calling a direction when she said, "Side door. Maintenance corridor. It connects to the parking structure on the next block." He stopped, looked at her, adjusted. They went out the side. Maintenance corridor, as she'd said. Connected to the parking structure on the next block, as she'd said. They were in the car. Mass people understood which direction to move. Driving back, Callum said, "You were right. I know. About the exit. I know." A beat. Then, quieter. "You would have made a good cartographer." Not a compliment about skills. She heard what he was actually saying. She didn't answer in words, but the deliberate gap she had been keeping closed without ceremony. That evening, with the first piece of evidence secured and the map's directions confirmed as accurate, they sat in the office with no map on the table for the first time. "My father left me a note," she said. "Not in the map. Separate. I found it when I went through his reading chair." What did it say? He said the most important thing I ever mapped was the people worth protecting. He listed 3 names. She stopped. "Mine, Daniel's." Another pause. "Callum's." Silence. "He listed me. He listed you." Callum looked at his hands. The note had been written before he made the wrong choice, before Edmund died, before Callum failed to warn him, which meant it described what Edmund had seen in him before that failure. Something worth protecting. Something worth mapping. "He wasn't saying you're perfect," Nora said.
It's the same thing.
"No, they're not." She looked at him. But I think he was right about both. The quiet that settled after that was a different kind of quiet than any they had sat in before. Not uncomfortable, not performed. Just the particular stillness of 2 people who have decided, without announcement, that they are in this together. The other 6 pieces of evidence came together over the next 4 days. 4 were retrieved in Chicago, a safe deposit box, a locked section of a university library's restricted archive, a store locker in Wicker Park, and a sealed envelope at an attorney's office held under instructions Edmund had filed 12 years earlier. One was in Milwaukee, retrieved by a contact of Callum's who had worked with Edmund directly. And the last piece in Boston was found by Daniel. Nora had told him enough. He found it in a locked box in the back of his apartment building's storage room, a box that had been shipped there under their grandfather's business name 2 years before Edmund died. Daniel photographed everything, confirmed the contents, and drove it to Chicago himself that weekend. He arrived on a Friday evening with Lily in the back seat. His daughter had just turned 5. She had her mother's eyes and her grandfather's quality of paying close attention to things that most people walked past without noticing. When all 7 pieces were assembled in Callum's office and laid out in the order Edmund's map specified, the complete picture was visible for the first time. Not just a case against Senator Mast. A 20-year record of how political power and criminal infrastructure had grown together in this city. Who funded whom, who knew what, who had benefited from looking the other way, and when. Edmund Voss had documented it the way a scientist documents an ecosystem. Not in judgment, in precision. Every relationship mapped, every transaction traced, every year of it preserved. He wasn't trying to bring it all down at once, Norisasa said. "No," Callum agreed. He was making sure it couldn't be erased, that if someone found it at the right moment with the right tools, it would be usable. Yes. She looked at the archive materials spread across the desk, the boxes, the folders.
The sealed record.
The work of a man she had underestimated for most of her life, not his intelligence, but the scale of what he had quietly done with it. "He always intended for it to go to Hargrove," she said. Callum was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think he did. Under my employee number, in my archive, where I control the access protocols." She looked up. "He built the whole thing around where I would be." "He knew you'd be here," Callum said. "He counted on it." The wedding had been Callum's idea. Not a real wedding, a staged one. A controlled performance designed to draw Senator Mast into a room where he would believe he had the advantage, and where everything he said would be witnessed. The woman standing at the altar beside Callum was one of his people. She had spent 3 years embedded in Mast's network, trusted, relied upon, believed to be the senator's most reliable connection to Callum's operation. By appearing to formalize that relationship through a ceremony, Callum created the impression that he was being brought under control, that Mast had won. Mast would come. Mast would say what powerful people say when they believe they've already secured the outcome. And everything said in that room would be heard by the right people. Nora knew the full plan. She had agreed to it. She would stand at the back of the room and observe, which was, as Callum pointed out, exactly what she was best at. What nobody planned for was Daniel. He arrived with Lily on Friday on the evening, as scheduled. The wedding was Saturday. Nobody had thought to tell him not to bring his daughter. Nobody had thought it would matter. Lily was 5 years old. She had spent the evening hearing adults talk in lowered voices about a wedding that wasn't a wedding, about a man named Mast who was dangerous, about her uncle Callum standing at an altar next to someone who wasn't the right person. She didn't understand most of the words. She understood the shape of the thing. The next morning, dressed in her drapes done by her father in the hotel room, she sat in the car while Daniel and Nora had a quiet conversation outside, and she listened. She understood one thing clearly. Uncle Callum was going to marry someone wrong. The banquet hall on the near north side was full by the time the ceremony began. Callum stood at the altar in a dark suit, without a boutonniere. The woman beside him was composed and correct and utterly still. Neither of them looked at the other. The assembled guests, a mixture of Callum's people, Mast's people, and a handful of carefully positioned witnesses, maintained the quiet of people, following a script. Nora stood at the back of the room, coat on, hands in her pockets. She watched the senator 2 rows from the front, the way he held himself, slightly too relaxed, the posture of a man who believed he was watching something go his way. He had said three things since entering the room that were now on record. He would say more before this was done. The officiant had just begun speaking when the doors at the back of the hall opened. Lily ran in, pink dress, braids starting to come loose, cheeks flushed from running down the hotel corridor, and through the lobby, and across the sidewalk, and through the front entrance. She ran down the center of the aisle without stopping, without looking at the faces turning toward her, and when she was close enough, she screamed with everything she had. "Don't marry her. Uncle Callum, don't." The room went absolutely still. Not a single person moved. Mast's people were for 11 minutes that this was a trap. One of them had identified a recording device 8 minutes after entering the room. They had been deciding how to exit cleanly when the little girl appeared. Now they couldn't move without confirming exactly what they were doing there. Callum's people knew this was the plan, but not this part. Not the child. They held position because that was what they were there to do, and because the child was not a threat to anything except the performance itself. Mast stood in the 3rd row, with his hands at his sides, and looked at a 5-year-old girl who had just destroyed the entire arrangement with 8 words. He had nothing to say. She was right. Everyone in the room knew she was right. Callum looked down at her. His face did not change. His face rarely changed. But his eyes did the calculating quality that she had first noticed in the reading room of the Hargrove Institute, the quality of a person reading a map rather than looking at a face. That quality was gone. What was there instead was something much simpler. He looked up, past Lily, past the altar and the frozen guests and the senator who had nothing to say, straight to the back of the room, at Nora. She was looking back at him. She had been watching the room the way she watched every room, cataloging, noting, waiting, but when his eyes found hers, she stopped cataloging. He wasn't reading her. He was just looking at her. She understood, in that moment, exactly what her father had meant when he wrote Callum's name on that list. Not that he was perfect, not that he had done everything right, that he was worth it, the particular kind of worth that a careful man assigns when he has watched someone long enough to see what they are, underneath everything that went wrong. Lily looked up at Callum and said, with the authority of a 5-year-old who has done something important, "I came to stop it." Callum crouched down to her level. His voice when he spoke was the quietest it had been all day. "I know," he said. "Thank you." The room moved then carefully in the directions that had been planned, minus the pretense that had been planned with it. Masked people found the exits they were meant to find. Callum's witnesses confirmed what they had witnessed. The senator, with the particular self-preservation intelligence of a man who had survived in politics for 20 years, understood that the damage was done, and that any further action would only compound it. He left without speaking to anyone. Callum found him in the lobby. "What your father built will go into a historical archive," Callum said, "sealed for 25 years. By then, either the landscape has changed enough that it no longer matters, or it matters enough that it should be found." Mast looked at him. "If you move against anyone connected to this Miss Voss, her brother, anyone at Hargrove, all of it goes out, tomorrow. You'd expose yourself." "Edmund Voss spent 20 years building something to protect people," Callum said. "I'm in the business of honoring that. What I expose doesn't matter as much as what I protect." Mast was quiet for a long moment. Then he walked to the door and through it and out into the cold street. That evening, Nora was in the archive late, working through the cataloging protocols for the Edmund Voss historical collection. The sealed access parameters. The 25-year restriction. The encoding key that would allow the right person at the right moment to read what was there. Callum arrived without calling ahead. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Is it done?" she asked. "Mast won't move. The materials are safe." She kept working for a moment. Then, "What did you say to him?" Callum told her. "Word for word the thing about honoring Edmund's work, the thing about what he exposed mattering less than what he protected." She listened carefully. "You meant that," she said. "Yes, that's different from before." She stood and walked to the shelf where she had been keeping the last item. A small archival box, acid-free, sealed with a label in her own handwriting. She set it on the desk in front of him. "My father left one more thing, not in the map. In the archive itself catalogued under my employee number, flagged for my attention. His journals, 20 years of them. Everything he thought and observed and documented that never made it into the maps." She slid the box toward him. "He filed them for you. Your access level, not mine. He knew you would be here." Callum looked at the box for a long time. He didn't open it. "He mapped everything," he said. "Everything worth keeping." He looked up at her. There was something in his expression she hadn't seen there before, not the calculating quality, not the controlled composure. Something that looked like a person who had just arrived somewhere after a very long journey. "What do you want to do after this?" "After this meaning after tonight, after the archive, after the map." She thought about it honestly. "I want to keep doing what I do. Cataloging things, understanding patterns, finding what people leave behind." A pause. "You?" He didn't answer right away. This was a question he hadn't given himself permission to consider for years. "I want to stop knowing everything about everyone. I want to start with not knowing what comes next and find out as it happens." "That sounds genuinely terrifying for you." "It is." She looked at him. "There's a research consultation position opening at the Institute. Someone who knows how to read historical patterns and connect them to present behavior. The pay is terrible. I don't need the money. I know. Are you offering me a job, Miss Voss?" "I'm offering you a reason to show up somewhere every day where someone will notice, miss, if you don't." He was quiet for a moment. Then he moved slowly, deliberately, and put his hand against her face. The way she read her father's maps, with his fingertips, like he was checking whether something was real. She didn't move away. "I'll show up," he said, 6 months later. The Hargrove Institute archive in late afternoon was everything it had always been: fluorescent light, old paper, the quiet that settled over a place where documents went to be kept. Nora's desk was where it had always been, third from the door, lamp angled left for her reading hand. The desk next to hers was new. Notebook, pen, no computer. Callum sat there 3 afternoons a week, doing research for a project they were building together, a historical collection, documenting how Chicago had changed across different eras. Not an exposé, not a case file, a record. The kind of thing that would sit in the archive for 100 years and tell whoever found it, This is how things connected. This is what was real. This is what people chose to preserve and what they chose to let go. Edmund would have liked it. Daniel brought Lily to visit on a Saturday in spring. She had grown another inch since the wedding. She walked straight to Callum's desk when she arrived, looked at the notebook, looked at him, and said with complete seriousness, "Do you remember the wedding?" "I remember." "I saved you." He looked at her for a beat. "Yes, you did." She nodded, satisfied, and went to find Nora. Daniel watched her go and then looked at Callie with the expression of a younger brother evaluating a new addition to the family. He said quietly to Nora, "He's kind of terrifying." "He's kind of everything," she said. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then, "Dad would have liked him." She didn't answer. But she didn't disagree. Phil retired in March. His last day, he stopped Callum in the lobby, something he had never done before, always maintaining the particular professional distance of a security guard who understood he was guarding something more complex than a building. He held out his hand. Callum shook it. "Take care of her," Phil said. Not a warning, not a request. The kind of thing one person says to another when they trust the answer. "I intend to," Callum said. Phil nodded once. Walked out into the afternoon. On a Tuesday evening in April, the archive closed at 9, as it always did. Nora walked through the stacks, turning off the lights, her old habit, row by row, moving from memory through the dark. 34,000 documents. She still knew where every one of them was. Callum was standing by the door with his coat over his arm, waiting. She turned off the last light. The room went dark, except for the exit sign above the door, its red glow falling across the nearest shelves, the nearest files, the nearest 30 years of other people's carefully kept evidence. She walked toward him. She knew the way. This was her space. "Ready?" "Yes." They went out together. The door locked behind them. The archive settled into its nighttime quiet, the particular silence of 34,000 documents keeping their places in the dark, waiting to be found by whoever needed to find them, patient in the way that well-kept things are always patient. Her father had spent 20 years mapping what mattered. She understood now what he had been working toward, not a record of damage, but a record of what was worth protecting. She had his hands, his habit of noticing, his particular faith that the right things, properly preserved, would outlast the people who wanted them gone. She carried that forward. She carried it alongside a man who had spent 11 years knowing everything about everyone, and was learning, slowly, that the things most worth knowing were the ones you allowed yourself not to know in advance. The archive held 34,000 documents. It held her father's maps, updated quarterly for 12 years, marked in the margins with observations about a city that kept changing and the structures underneath it that did not. It held, in a sealed box with restricted access and a 25-year lock, everything Edmund Voss had built and everything it had cost. It held, in the consultation records under a new access credential, the beginning of something that had no name yet except ongoing. And it held, in no file and no catalog and no index that anyone would ever search, the specific kind of quiet that settles into a room when two people have stopped performing and started simply being. The quiet of a desk moved close to another desk. The quiet of a light turned off by someone who knows the way. The quiet of a door that closes and locks and holds. The way good things hold against whatever the city outside decides to do next. That was worth keeping too. That was the cartographer's daughter's work. This book is a work of imagination. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are products of the author's creativity or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance results to real persons or actual events is unintentional and should not be construed as factual representation.
Before we close this story, I want to tell you what I think Edmund Voss was really building. Not a case file, not a weapon, a message. He spent 20 years in the most dangerous world imaginable, surrounded by people who used information to control, to threaten, to destroy. And he made a different choice. Every single day for 20 years he chose to use what he knew to protect people instead of harm them. That choice cost him everything, and he made it anyway. That is the first lesson this story carries. Power is not what you accumulate. Power is what you choose to do with what you know. on the days when doing the right thing is the most expensive option available. The second lesson belongs to Nora. She spent her entire life being invisible, overlooked by the police, overlooked by the world, kept in the dark by the father who loved her most. And instead of becoming bitter about that invisibility, she became dangerous because of it. She learned to see everything while nobody watched her back. She learned to read what was missing from a room as clearly as what was present. And when the moment came, she was the only person alive who could finish what her father started, not despite being overlooked, but because of it. The world will underestimate you. Let it. The person nobody sees coming is the person nobody can stop. The third lesson is about trust, real trust, the kind that costs something. Callum Reyes knew everything about everyone. And the one person he had no file on was the one person who changed him. He had built 11 years of armor from grief and information, and the absolute refusal to be caught not knowing. And a woman with 34,000 documents memorized and no interest in performing walked through all of it without trying to. That is what genuine trust looks like, not blind faith, not ignoring what someone has done. Trust built on evidence, maintained through honest conditions, and chosen every day as a deliberate act. Edmund Voss mapped what mattered. He mapped relationships and evidence and 20 years of a city's hidden architecture. But the most important thing he ever mapped, as he wrote in his final note, was the people worth protecting. That is the only map worth building. That is the only power worth having.